Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the real costs that are associated with CMMC compliance and hopefully give some tips on how to avoid overspending or investing more time than you really need to. So um, we'll start with the big elephant in the room. The probably the most common question you get is how much is this all gonna cost us?
Like 350, like
Three,
350.
three,
Yeah.
$3 and no, okay.
Yeah. Per minute, per user. No, I'm just kidding. It depends, right? Like the scope and probably a lot of what we're going to cover in this video will help break it down. But if anyone gives you a for sure price, I can promise you that is not a good solution. And I actually dislike that a lot. One thing I really like to do with customers is talk real numbers. It's just easier for me and them. Like I tell customers, I don't want you to get on board with us. And then suddenly I turn around and say, guess what, guys, you need to spend $37,000. Thanks for signing up. Now you need to spend 37 grand. I'm going to have that conversation way earlier, just because I think it's the only way you can build trust. But anyway, that's a whole different topic. But yeah, no one's going to be able to give you a real example of what it's going to cost, in my opinion.
But you've seen people quoted like six figures.
Oh yeah. So I should have big asterisk by my previous statement. If I supply everything, meaning if we sat down and said, as a company, Infinity, we can build a virtual desktop for this much money. We can, pair it with the licenses of these products. We can do all that. You can get a per user cost. And then when somebody comes to me and says, I have 20 users, it's take that per user cost I just gave you, multiply it by 20. There may be some onboarding or projects tied into that. And then we can give you a cost. To me, that's just a terrible way to do it. It probably fits in some spaces, so I don't want to bemoan people that use that solution. But it's just not. It's usually sticker shock. We
Yeah.
get the call after the clients meet with that other provider. Sometimes, we called provider X and they told me it's $197 per user per month, and or something like that. And I go, okay, well, what were they going to do? And we walk through it, and you usually have an idea. Well, what if we reduce your scope, or you don't need all of that, or looks like you already own this? But I could be spoiling the rest of this content, so I don't want to jump too
Yeah,
far
well,
ahead.
let's go there. So you're talking about why cost estimates can vary a lot. So what are some
Yeah.
reasons for why that is?
Well, the scope, and
Yeah.
probably the scope. That's the biggest thing that I see people struggle with, and it's actually not a hard conversation. Um, you have to know where your CUI is coming from, where it's going. So one of the very first thing I do is a data map, right? So you have this type of data coming from here and going here. You have this type of data come from here and going here. This is where it's stored. This is where it's processed. This is where it's transmitted. CUI, FCI, other important data. And once I know that map, I can say, okay, who's involved, right? Who's at each step of this process? How many people? So you have a company of 57 people. You scope it correctly and find that only 9 people, right, are
Mhm.
handling CUI. That's a different conversation than trying to build an environment for 50 plus people, right? And it's not usually, I would say that is the single most important thing to get correct, to not
It's the
overspend.
enclaving, getting the enclaving right.
Yeah, yeah. Trying to build up some kind of enclave, either internally segmented in your own organization, or maybe a cloud, like a CSP solution or a VDI solution or GCC, which is a little trickier, Microsoft 365, because, some people aren't happy with two tenancies, but it depends a lot. We've talked to some very big organizations that have huge numbers, like 15, 1,600 people spread across multiple campuses. And then once I started digging down to it, it was such a small subset that was dealing with CUI, and they were all in one building. So, it was very
Hmm.
easy to say, maybe we should just build a micro GCC high tenancy for those users and set up the right rules so no data can leak, and, all of that. So yeah, scoping is the thing. That's the thing. And then enclaving.
And then also their current security state matters as well, right? Like if they've got
It
decent security practices.
Yeah, and that's that's usually once we start to move forward. So an initial conversation, we'll have that scoping, talk about enclaving, and then I'll say, what do you have? And review that. That's usually like the first big load of work for me, is to see where you have stuff that already works. If you have stuff that already works, kind of again counter to that this much per user mindset.
Yeah.
We don't want to rebuy that. If you have a SIEM in place, or you have an internal IT that can lift part of the load, we will leverage as much of that as you want to. That can help reduce costs quite a lot.
Okay. So when we are talking about costs, we're talking not just about money, but also about time.
Oh yeah.
So why don't we hit on? We've got a few different buckets of where the costs are, where the time and money typically goes. First one you listed here was assessment and planning.
Yeah. So you really think of it as two types of cost, and every business owner is going to know that. There's like project cost is one thing we'll talk about. We need to do this one-time thing, get this one-time piece of technology deployed, rolled out, set up, configured. Maybe it's the enclave, whatever. And then you have your reoccurring cost. As an MSP, we're part of that, both sides of that equation sometimes, but I always focus on leveraging whatever pieces we need to keep the reoccurring cost as low as possible. Design a solution that's going to be good for you for 3, 5 longer years. And that doesn't mean the project cost goes up, but that's just one thing you have to talk about. The reason I started talking there, even though, you mentioned assessment and planning, is a lot of that assessment stuff, especially if you're working with a good provider, they're kind of due along the way. Remember when I was just talking about show me what you have, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you show me what you have and you have a really nice scene, right? And you've showed me in your documentation that you provided that your scene alerts are working and you have all this great stuff configured, then as I'm doing my kind of mock gap assessment, as you will, I kind of can start filling that out some of the way. It doesn't replace getting an actual gap assessment, and that is a one-time cost that you're probably going to look at dealing with no matter what. But having a good idea of what you have can reduce that cost a little bit. But it is important, having a real gap assessment is it's the benchmark. I think people misunderstand why companies like us would offer to do a gap assessment, but it also helps me ensure that you have buy-in. One of the biggest challenges we run into, and you mentioned time, is, they think they can call a company like Infinity, the client does it, and we're just going to give them this key and they hit the start button and suddenly we're CMMC compliant. That's not at all how that works, planning and working through policy and all that. But yeah, so spending some money up front to get a good gap assessment, even after have that initial data flow and the scoping and an idea. Literally sent that email before this meeting. New customer to us was like, all right, Curtis, what do you think our timeline is going to be? And I'm like, we haven't picked a solution, so I can roll out Prevail in this timeline. I can go GCC in this timeline. I can go, it's not always the same. It's kind of one of the things about Infinity not having a one size fits all solution. We're very agnostic when it comes to vendors. We help find the solution that's going to work best in your situation, which changes the gap assessment, changes everything, but I need you to help me pick, right? Like I can just give you the options. I can't pick it for you.
So you've hit on it a little bit, the technologies and the tools. I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate any more on, the Microsoft question as far as commercial versus GCC, or maybe alternatives to what typically is more expensive Microsoft licensing, like Prevail, for example.
Well, we talked in a previous video a little bit about Business Premium, which is one of the newer solutions that's going to drive the cost for companies to go into GCC. It's not going to fit for everybody, but it's probably going to fit for a lot of our clients, which is good. Then you have enclave solutions. You can go with a FedRAMP approved CSP like Prevail. Obviously, we like Prevail for small government contractors. I think it's a great solution. And there's others. The thing you run into is sometimes now and again you'll have a client say, "Hey, Curtis, I got this business card, or I got an email from this company who's got turnkey CMMC." And, I start reading all these guarantees and the pricing and get really nervous. I'm like, I don't know what they mean. There's some solutions out there, and you kind of wanted me to talk about the different technology, but you kind of have like do it yourself internally. Maybe you have servers. Maybe you can build your own your own CUI safe space on those servers, and you can definitely do that. We can help. That's going to require one set of technical tools. Then you have cloud service providers like Prevail, who give you a lot of those tools, still requires some additional tools. Then you have GCC, which we were talking about a moment ago with GCC High, and we actually have commercial too. You have splits, maybe your FCI is going to stay in commercial, which it can, and your CUI is going to go to GCC High G3 or G5. Then you have business premium. So there's a lot. And the thing is, it's not just picking your main solution for CMMC. There's different tools that support each of those solutions you pick. So Prevail is going to have a different set of tools underneath it that we would configure and provide. GCC is going to have a different set of tools. So it's very complicated, when you're trying to explain it to somebody, but for us, it's not so much
Well,
as
the good
IT
news
folks,
is,
but yeah.
the good news is there's options, right? You're not
Yeah,
railroaded into one.
definitely. And I've yet to meet somebody who didn't. Well, most people want the cheapest option. There's some familiarity with 365, and that can be good. So it can help with buy-in. Buy-in is connected to time. Time's connected to money. So there's a lot of things you have to weigh.
Yeah. All right. So another place where probably the biggest time sink for management and staff is the documentation and the policies.
Yep. And ironically, that ties into what solution you take. Prevail has their compliance accelerator, which can help. We actually get a lot of people who buy Prevail on their own and then start using the compliance accelerator and then are lost immediately and call us, not to knock on Prevail. If I didn't like it, I wouldn't keep mentioning them. But, that's where the rubber really meets the road to me. I can, like I've said in other videos, and I'll say it here again, we can get the technology stuff stood up pretty fast. But then being able to provide evidence-based, documentation, policy and procedure, and even verification of technical controls, when the rubber meets the road, to say that again as well, you as the OSC are going to be dealing with an assessor. Us, if we're your MSP and I'm your RPA, will be able to be there with you. But together we have to be able to demonstrate evidence to an assessor, right? So you can have the best SSP in the world. And if an assessor asks you, oh, this looks really good, can you show me how you're doing this? And you can't, you will fail. So that's where the time sink is for me. It's making sure that the people are educated, make sure they've been trained, make sure they understand where what is, not just having the policy, but having a really good policy structure. I've had clients that build all their policies in SharePoint, which sounds kind of crazy, but it works really well because stuff can be linked. Other clients do Word documents, PDFs, or whatever, but making sure that you as the OSC understands how all of that is built is very important. And then getting the buy-in, the executive authority. Sometimes the person I'm working with to get the compliance isn't the person that can finalize approval on policy. So you end up with a time gap there sometimes. You take this to your boss and they're reading through this document. And we can't do all that. Now I'm in a call with the higher ups, explaining why we have to do it this way. So things like that happen. But yeah, that's the time cost.
All right. Next up, implementation and remediation. So it's closing the gaps that have been identified and then actually implementing the technical piece.
Yeah. And those are usually projects most of the time. For clients that are, have an MSP, some of those solutions will be part of the contract agreement. At least that's how ours work. So depending on, if you're working with an MSP like us, and we know that you're targeting CMMC level 2, and we know that you're using GCC, for example, we can build those tools that you're going to need, but we still have to implement them. We have to get training on them. A good example of that is how we do some of our logging reviews, even for level 1, which is a whole different conversation. But, I have to train somebody at your organization. Hey, you're going to get this log file. This is what it's going to say. I want you to keep that log file. I want you to document that you reviewed that log file in this place, little things like that. So the technical piece is easy. We literally add you to the list, say who gets the report. Technically, we're done. But now I got to teach you how to read the report, teach you where to store the data, teach you what we're looking for, why an assessor would want you to do this, things like that.
Yep. All right. Then the big one that probably scares most people is the actual assessment costs.
Yep. And it's scary. Like it's expensive, it's supply and demand in a lot of ways. There's not a lot of assessors. There's more every week. I bet every month there's more assessors. So things are getting more competitive. Assessors also, the ones I work with, I go to great lengths to explain just how well everything's built. So when I'm talking to an assessor, I'm saying, this is how we built it. This is what we did. This is what we used. They're working with us. We have a shared responsibility matrix with them. These are the controls we're handling for them, or at least partially, or maybe they're working with Prevail and Prevail's handling all this. And, having those conversations, what drives the cost down, you hope. But no assessor is going to tell you, it's a couple of grand, you'll be fine. They're just not going to say that. I've heard everything from, 20, 30, 40 grand up to 120 grand, and depends on the size of the organization. You can imagine all the things that factors in. what solution you have, what's your scope look like. Are you really ready? Are you going to do a mock assessment and then go to a real assessment, which I always, encourage. I'd be terrified to go straight to a real assessment. And there's reasons for that, but yeah, the cost, I wouldn't quote one. I just tell customers I won't. I'll put you in touch with an assessor and y'all can have the conversation. And if you want me to tell you when you should have that conversation, I will. And I'm going to make sure you're fully aware of everything that we have so you can answer those questions when you talk to that assessor. But that's really all I can do there.
Yeah. All right. And then the last big cost center can be ongoing maintenance. Because of the recertification requirement. Yeah.
Well, so you should be self-check. You have to. Part of CMMC is self-assessing every year, right? Some customers do it. I'm going to do 10 controls a week, and just check those and then keep it rolling. Some that work with us will do like a big assessment every year. So, maybe in November, October, that tends to be our assessment heavy area. We'll say, okay, I'm going to stop talking to you like an RPA. I'm going to start talking to you like an assessor. We have a whole platform and software to do it. We walk through all the controls. I'm going to expect the OSC to produce evidence, and make sure that we've checked everything. We build that into our contracts, but there's a cost there, right? So doing that, having the tool and having somebody to walk you through all of that is going to be a cost. And then, of course, you have to get recertified. Plus, if you have any major changes, this is a big topic in the industry right now. What constitutes a major change?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're set up on GCC and everything's going great, but you change your scene. Is that a major change? Where in your shared responsibility matrix was your scene map? What if you're working with an MSP like Infinity and they tell you they're changing their product?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, we were delivering this. Did the SRM change? Does that trigger another assessment? Is it going to cost as much as the first assessment? And then you have the whole conversation around cage codes. A lot of these companies will spin up a new contractor, business to take care of one piece, but it's really the same. Well, it's a new cage code. You need a new assessment. This is something people don't realize. They think they can get one cage code done. And I'm pretty sure, there's a lot of complexity here. So I don't want to talk out of turn, but those kind of things you don't really want as the guy who's providing guidance. I don't want to see a lot of changes. Let's pick a solution. This is going to be our solution for 3 years. Please don't change anything. And to take a little bit of fear out of that, there's room to grow and expand. If you have 10 employees today and you get your assessment done and all 10 are in scope or whatever, and then you win a big contract, you need to pick up 20 more. You don't need to get reassessed for that if everything's the same. You're using the same enclave, the same technology, but there are things that will trigger it. That can be one of those costs people don't count.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So let's move on slightly, but this kind of dovetails in with what we were just talking about, but some common ways companies overspend. Maybe we could kind of keep these as high level because you've hit on a lot of this already.
Yeah.
Maybe, kind of high level, just a summary bullet point type thing for people to be able to go through quickly.
And I think the first one, and it's our first bullet point, is making sure your scope's accurate. You don't want to put things in your boundary that don't need to be in your boundary. And I mean, this is actually, I don't want to say argumentative, that's the wrong word, but this is somewhere I really push, and
it's the most critical piece, right?
Yeah. But you get some clients, and I love these clients. I just can't let them waste money when they're like, we're just going to do this so we're future proof. And that's fine until they start seeing dollars. Right. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, this would be a lot cheaper if you didn't include these 20 people that you cannot demonstrate to me that they ever touch CUI. Right. I know you wanna. And I know, you're hoping for that, but you just have to scope accurately. I'll say it till I run out of air. You have to scope accurately and make sure that you're not overscoping. That's the big one. But there's some more. Which tools you pick. This was really big in the beginning. Everybody was running out to get quotes on GCC High, including us. And it was expensive. I've had a client this close to buying GCC High to find out once I started working with them, they were level 1. It's not even the same client I mentioned before. And they had no aspirations going level 2. They were literally a sub to a big contractor. They've been doing the same thing for years. They want to keep doing the same thing. And I was like, no, you do not need to buy GCC High. You're not handling any CUI. All you're doing is dealing with, matter of fact, it turned out 2 employees were dealing with FCI in the whole organization. So it's pretty funny to me, but making sure you're buying the right tools. Don't go buy the Cadillac if all you need is a Toyota.
Yeah.
Although Toyotas probably cost as much as Cadillacs now.
Yeah.
That's a different conversation.
Skipping the gap assessment can be
that'll burn you. That usually dovetails in with people we talked about in the previous video. I have an IT guy and we've done our self-assessment, so we know where we're at, and all we need you guys to do is help us implement this one thing. Those are my least favorite, because I immediately start responding with, I can help you implement that thing, just don't tell me that because of what I've done you are now compliant. I'll never say that until I've gone through an assessment with you. I'm never gonna tell you you're compliant. Doing the gap assessment will always cover you there. Covers me too. So I like us both to know what needs to be done.
Yep.
And GCC, we talked about that a little bit already, but the biggest thing there, and I'm not quite ready to speak on it completely, because in my mind, what I'm trying to do is look at G3, G5, and then business premium and get a really clean map of the differences before I can really tell a customer, I think business premium is going to work for you. That is something I want to do. I'm just not quite there yet, but it's kind of dovetails in the enterprise solution. Like you don't want to buy G5s if you don't need G5s. Yeah. Then you have to measure in what a company like Infinity is already providing you. Sentinel gets talked about a lot, cool product, but sometimes you don't need all that. Yeah. Sentinel has a pretty high learning curve, which means you need people that earn a lot of money to read that, to configure that Sentinel stuff. So like we can, but yeah. And that dovetails into exactly, I'm stealing all your thunder here, but figuring out what you already have. Sometimes clients already bought some cool tool, and us being pretty agnostic with which tools we use, we don't mind that at all. If the tool will do the job, we'll figure out how to make it do the job. And that can save you some money. Especially if you've already bought some, usually this conversation around cybersecurity stuff. But if you already have some of those tools and they're good and, they're approved for CUI, then it can be leveraged a lot. And then the last one here, the longer you wait, the more expensive it gets. That's true pretty much of anything. It's just, I have not seen us turn the corner. It'll happen in the next probably 3 to 5 years that some of these solutions will probably get cheaper, but that's not what's happening today. I mean, all the circles I run in, people getting certifications and watching their paychecks run up means somebody's paying for it. So,
Right.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So let's switch over to maybe some smart approaches to managing costs, sticking with the cost theme, but
yeah,
we've probably talked about it a lot throughout the long version of this video, but starting with scoping is key.
Yeah, that is definitely the key, and it'll continue to be. Doing some type of gap assessment. The reason I don't always say do like a formal gap assessment is until a lot of times when clients come to us, they haven't implemented anything. It's pretty rare they've implemented something. They're totally leaning on us to implement. And I want to pick a solution. You have two options. I could do a gap assessment where you are, and I'll do that if you want to. But if you're coming to me saying, I already know that we're 3% done, and you're coming to me because you want to be 60% done, sometimes doing a gap's a little bit of a waste. I still encourage people to do them, even if it's not a formal. And anybody who does gap assessments like we do will tell you very plain the difference. Like I could do a formal gap assessment. We're going to get a report that shows you all the stuff you're missing. Happy to do that. But if you're telling me that you have CUI, in your Microsoft 365 commercial environment, and, all 6 of your employees are printing CUI and laying it around the office and sticking it to whiteboards in the entrance hall or something, that gap assessment is probably not where you want to spend your money. Let's spend your money on building a scope. Let's talk about what we want to build. Let's start building it. We're still going to do a gap assessment, but let's kind of put gas in the car and start driving on the road first. You guys are still sitting in the driveway. Picking the right stuff is important too, which kind of all goes together. I feel like people are probably like, why does it keep talking about scoping? Because it burns people most time, but it's all connected, right? Scoping, picking the solution, rolling that stuff out is helpful. Rolling it out in small pieces, which is a note you have here, is helpful too. Yep. That kind of harkens back to my level 1 who wants to go to level 2. We have the plan. We know the pricing. We have quotes ready, although they're not good forever, but we know exactly when that person tells me, let's roll to level 2, what it's going to look like. I have another client who's asking me to do that for them now, We're level 1. That's all we need to be today. Curtis helped me build a plan to be level 2. And that's almost, you could consider that a phased implementation. It's hard to say anybody that needs to be level 2 should do a phased implementation now, because frankly, they should be standing on the gas now. But if you're not sure, or maybe you're thinking about going after a new market or some new contracts, then you can kind of roll a phased implementation in.
Yeah. And then most of what we work with are SMBs, making sure that they're right sizing their technology choices is
100%. Yeah. And it kind of all ties back in, but it dovetails into working with a company like us. Sometimes we just get called on to do some consulting, which is fine too. But a lot of the times that consulting either turns into them working with us, especially if they try to start looking at what it costs to hire people to come in that know how to implement this stuff. But you still want to right size, you still want to make sure that you're not rolling out some giant enterprise solution versus talking to an MSP that may be a quarter of the cost of that solution alone to kind of do everything from a technology side. And then making sure that your enclave, which again is part of scoping, you can't separate the two, but making sure you get all that right.
Cool. All right. So overall, planning is what prevents expensive mistakes. That's kind of the key takeaway. Yeah.
And it's not just a key takeaway. They almost stand in opposition, right? This is the pressure. This is what keeps people up at night. I need to find somebody to plan with, but I need to do this as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. So you can almost feel the pressure in those two statements to say, let me just buy GCC. At least I got that, or let me just buy a Prevail license, like, let me just find the solution, throw money at it right now because I can sleep better knowing that I've done something. Mm-hmm. When in reality, you may end up talking to a guy like me who goes, didn't really need to buy that, or glad you bought it, but all you did was, you're instead of being 2%, you're at 8% now. Yeah. You're nowhere near 90. But anyway, sorry, I'm venting at this point.
All right, let's change gears and kind of from the other angle, the cost of not getting compliant.
Yeah, and this is something, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but this is something that I think people sleep on a little bit. The value is there. And I'm going to, instead of talking about the one most people talk about where I have to be compliant because this clause is in my contract right now and I got an emergency, because they don't need any more motivation. It becomes a question of get compliant or go out of business. I'm talking more where you're primed. Let's say your prime is busy working through compliance right now, and they're starting to ask you questions. Imagine there's three subs that they can talk to that all do what you do, and you're the first one to say, "Yeah, I'm done. I'm ready. I've already got my third-party assessment." That's gonna hold value. That's probably not really measurable in your mind, in that prime's understanding of who you are as a sub. So to me, that's the biggest value there is. I know this is more about what can happen if you don't, but at the same time, you have to weigh in what can happen if you do. And I think absolutely. It's, you could probably charge more too. People don't ever talk about that, because the number of subs that are working today is probably going to retract a little bit, as some people just fail. They just fail. The prime's going to come calling and they're going to say we can't, and they're going to get scratched off that list. Yep.
It's kind of a reshuffling. There'll be a reshuffling period there for a little while.
Correct.
Out of the gate. Yep.
Yeah. And the reason this has been such a talking point is, like I mentioned earlier, there's such a conversation about when to get reassessed. And one of those conversation drivers is you have contractor A here who is friends with contractor B. Contractor A has got their assessment. They're in order. Contractor B is panicking. Can we just come under your cage code? Right. There's a lot that happens way more than people realized. And then you have the certifiers out there going, nope, you have to get recertified. So people are learning the hard way. There's not like a panic button that you can hit. You're just going to get scratched off the list.
And then delayed compliance, obviously.
Yeah, we talked about that. Everything's going to go up. It's just, seeing business premium come to market was good. That's actually one of the rare cases where Microsoft looked at the industry and said, probably under a lot of pressure, and said, yeah, we can meet this compliance in this cloud environment without you having to buy the Cadillac as I used before. So that's something. But as far as like the human costs, they're not going down. They're just going up. It's regularly, I thought I have, luckily our contractors are moving through the progress. But when this was really blowing up last year, I was starting to ask myself, how many of these can we manage? Not as a company, But the technology, the company side is easy, but it's like, I've got 5 meetings today. All 5 of these contractors that I'm meeting with today are all in different places, which is fine. But when they don't move, part of me wants to go, you tell me when you're ready to move again, because I don't want to allocate 2-hour meeting for you to tell me you haven't done anything. Sorry, I'm venting again. But that's one of those things, if people are going to, the resources are becoming more finite. That's all I'm trying to say. The people that know how to implement this stuff, the assessors that can come in and help you get your assessments done, it's growing, but it's not keeping up with the people that have the demands.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully we've hit on what are some common costs and how are some ways that you might be able to avoid those costs or save money in certain areas. And also, hopefully, we've highlighted. Curtis has done a great job of highlighting some of the areas that are the most important, like scoping and enclaving, and making sure you partner with somebody who can kind of help walk you through the entire process and stand by you when you're actually matching up with the assessor. So yeah, some great info, Curtis. Thank you very much, and
Cool.
thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.